Welcome back after lunch. I know there's probably a post-lunch slumber, so we're going to try to make it as exciting and lively as possible. All right, so it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Sophie Desoulieres. I work for MSF. I'm based in Amsterdam for the operational section in Amsterdam, and I head the Humanitarian Affairs and Operational Communications and Advocacy Department there. It's a pleasure for me as well to welcome today our panel, because it's a panel that's very, very diverse in the way that it is going to look at the different topics that we have at hand today. So I'd like to welcome Zahra Nader, who is a journalist, having worked with major news outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and who is the editor-in-chief of Zahn Times, which is a media that's focused on covering human rights issues in Afghanistan today. We also have Martin Suvatne, who is who's the managing director of NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council here in Germany. And online we have Gemma, Connell, who is with UN OCHA and heads their, sorry, I'm going to have to look at my notes, Gemma, because it's a long title. She is the chief of the Assessment, Planning and Monitoring branch for UN OCHA. So we're going to be looking at kind of the narratives and around crises and the categorizations around crises. We're talking about neglected, forgotten. We're talking about historic, unprecedented. I see it myself in MSF every given week. We're ourselves competing for attention with each other, calling out with regards to food insecurity, with regards to the impact of armed conflicts. We're talking about the romances. We were talking about the ones where everybody has their attention, the hospitals that are getting bombed, the people who are caught in the crossfire. But we're also talking about the less sexy holes in socks that we've gotten used to, right? Those protracted crises, and we're trying to draw attention to issues that have not gone away and that are certainly not going to go away anytime soon. By doing so, by putting things into categories, are we contributing to putting them into neat little boxes? Are we contributing to taking away politics, of taking away agency? Do we mobilize people by doing so, by those narratives, or do we actually numb people in paralysis, as we were discussing this morning? And so we'll be exploring as well, let's talk about hope. How can we mobilize effectively? How can we mobilize ethically and look into these issues and thematics and the role that we can play? I am also told to remind you, if you haven't by now remembered, that you can comment on Twitter or X using the hashtag HCBerlin. Questions and comments can be put in the Zoom Q&A window for our colleagues who are here online. And we have live captioning and live translation into French and Spanish, because we are not ourselves immune to our colonial legacies with regards to the use of languages. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Zahra. Because Zahra, Afghanistan today and has been on all of our minds. On Saturday, there was a massive earthquake in Herat. Casualties are among the thousands. And that has come in addition to a very, very dire situation, both in terms of humanitarian concerns, but also human rights concerns. In your view today, who now kind of holds the power in developing the narrative of what happens in Afghanistan? And to what extent do you find that voices actually from Afghanistan are able at all to drive the narrative with regards to categorizing what's happening?
Thank you so much, Sophie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share my perspective. In regard to the question that you asked, we talked about power here a lot today, and in terms of how power can shape narratives. And I think what's happening right now, who has the power to develop narratives in Afghanistan is, of course, the Taliban, which is a very misogynist group, extremist group, who some of you might have read about them. So what's happening is now is 2 years that at least half of the population have lost their human rights in Afghanistan. This happened since the Taliban take over in August 2021. So we have the Taliban in power from their very, very first day that they took power. They started developing their way of work into how they want to organize society. In their second week in power, which was August 24, 2021, they banned women from working in public sectors. In their first month in power, which was September 17, 2021, they banned girls beyond the primary education. And it moved on to very, recently they banned women from, so it was in December that they banned women from universities. And they banned women from working in aid, in organizations that are providing aid. And that had happened in a society that is like an estimated 11.5 million women are needing help, needing humanitarian help to live their lives. And then women aid workers are not allowed to work. When they are not allowed to work, that means this population will not be able to receive aid. So that's what's happening very much to summarize it on the ground. So women do not have any rights. They cannot work and earn their living. They cannot go to school. They cannot go to university. And lots of them are committing suicide because they feel no other ways to live their life except just ending their life because they don't see a hope at the end of the tunnel. So in regards to who shaped the narrative, so we have the Taliban in power. They do have control all means of communication right now in Afghanistan. They are forcing journalists who are working inside the country to send their statement, their reports to the Taliban so they can see and verify it before it's been published. So anything against the Taliban, if you are a journalist seeking truth, you cannot work inside the country. Your life is at risk. We have a French Afghan journalist, Mortaza Behboudi. He is in prison by the Taliban since January 7, 2023. Now, like, it's almost 10 months that he's in prison. Why? Because he wanted to report the truth in Afghanistan. We have people who have been in prison for just simply writing on social media, commenting or criticizing the Taliban and what they are doing. They are being imprisoned. So literally, those that are right now controlling the narrative in Afghanistan are the Taliban. And unfortunately, there's another layer to that is, of course, when the media that are functioning inside the country, they have to sort of accept what the Taliban is saying. Otherwise, they cannot function. So most of women journalists are forced out of work because it's two ways, because either the media cannot function and the media is closed. And the first journalist who had to leave their job is women journalists, because that's the one that, so if a local media is still running in Afghanistan, and if they do have women journalists working in their newsroom, they have the Taliban in their back. The Taliban would come and check to whether this woman do they have a separate office, whether she's covering her face or not, and all sorts of things. So for the media managers, it's easier to employ men than women right now. That's one cause. And the other cause is that women journalists have to have male chaperone, a man which is like blood-related family members with them when they are going out or reporting. So that's like a problem because they cannot pay for that man. Most of them don't have such a man in their lives. So most of women journalists have been driven out of the profession right now. And then we have social media. Unfortunately, social media like Meta, they are somehow censoring any critiques of the Taliban. So if you're using the word Taliban, you risk your social media to be restricted and it's funny because they allowed, if you want to say Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, they would allow it, but if you say the Taliban, which is the word that most critics use when talking about the Taliban in Afghanistan, they do not use their name of Islamic Emirate, but rather the Taliban. So they risk being censored by social media platform. And the organization that I'm working with, Zan Times, is a woman-led organization. We are covering human rights in Afghanistan. And we are based on, our main office is based in Canada, and we cannot post any news on social media, Meta, because they have legal issues with the government of Canada, not allowing any news to be posted. So we are also being, in a way, censored in social media to be able to share our stories. And then in terms of the narrative, whether Afghan voices are being able to heard, we have to ask what kind of voices that we are talking about, because there are two, even when we are talking in the context of Afghanistan, there are two groups that their voice is out there. If you go and search for them, you will find them. A small group of them is, unfortunately, because of their own benefit, are very much trying to whitewash the Taliban, to just say, hey, you know, we have recently a woman, she's based in London, and she worked in Afghanistan government before, and she went back to the country and traveled all the provinces driving and posting on social media saying, hey, life is very good here. Look at me, I can drive, I can travel. So what that means that every other who are saying that women's right is restricted is lying. So it's, I am the truth. And that comes with privilege, that comes with the discussion that they do have with the Taliban. There are certain group of people and some women who are able to go inside the country and be escorted by the Taliban wherever they're going. So that is not for all the people of Afghanistan, not for all the women inside the country. And then there's another group who is the majority of women right now in Afghanistan who are deprived of their rights. We have a group of women, very initially when the Taliban take over, we have lots of protests, women coming to the streets protesting. But as the situation worsened and the Taliban increased their restrictions of women's rights, they banned protests. In September 2021, they said any protests that do not have our approval would not be allowed to carry on. But most of these women did protest. They went to the streets. And until, I think, early January, there was not such a very harsh, except beating on the streets. They were not arrested officially. But then after January 2022, the Taliban started arresting women protesters for their rights to protest, for their rights in Afghanistan. So we have a few of these women, they are now, some of them are now in Germany, they're still protesting. So they were arrested for only taking part in protests. And then we have, this has increased. So we reported on October 2022, we reported that the Taliban have actually killed some of women protesters who participated in protests, in women's rights protests in Mazar-e-Sharif, in Balkh province in northern Afghanistan. So they actually went and killed this woman in order to silence them. So that is the length that they are willing to go, and that still continues. Right now, as I'm speaking, there's 2 women activists who have been arrested by the Taliban for their role in women's rights protests. And what that means that when the Taliban, when there are women who are protesting, who are trying to change the narrative that it's not all the Taliban, it's also us who are resisting, who are fighting back, that's how the Taliban respond to them. So they are taking risk, immense risk to their lives to be only able to raise their voice and hopefully change, you know, to what's happening right now in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Zahra, for giving us kind of the multifold elements that come into play to actually silencing the voices of Afghan women. I think it's no news to any of us, but it is particularly chilling to look at how social media, which was to be a tool of amplifying individual voices, is actually becomes a chilling tool of opposing authority and power. Yeah, thank you so much, and I look forward to discussing that with you and the audience. Martin, so you're with the NRC, and the NRC comes with a report about every year, right, looking at the 10 most neglected crises, the 10 most displacement-related crises, and looking at major displacement. These are not tiny displacement. They're over, I believe, 200,000 people, right? And what you say in this report is that neglect isn't just something that happens, it is a choice. And I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit for us. What do you mean by that? And what are some of the factors or elements that you take into account when looking at that categorization?
Yeah, then let's first look a bit at the definition of neglect. So neglect basically means to disregard. It means fail to care or fail to do something. We could also call it maybe forgotten crisis. But with all the information that we have in today's world, we cannot claim that we forgot. And also none of the countries on the list is neglected by accident. Neglect is a choice, an active choice. And we also see this in those crises that are not neglected. We see crises that receive the political will, they receive the funding, and also they receive the media attention. So if we want, we see it and we can do something about it. And then you ask about the methodology, what we did about. You were right, we looked at crises with more than 200,000 people displaced. 39 countries were analyzed. And we then decided on 3 factors. They gave them equal importance. The first factor is the lack of political will. So basically, the international community ability and willingness to look actively for a political solution for the country. So we looked at the UN Security Council resolutions, the peacekeeping missions, the special envoys, and all those things in relation to the size and the severity of the crisis. That's the first thing. The second thing is we looked at the lack of funding for humanitarian aid, basically comparing the funding appeals, how much money was raised compared to pledged. And thirdly, we looked at the lack of media attention. So basically the level of media coverage compared to the number of people displaced. We looked at some data platforms that provide this information. And here I would like to make a small personal side note to a CARES report, CARES analysis about breaking the silence, which is not part of our report, but it's a very interesting story if you have time to look at how media attention works. So in CARES report, they basically compared a bit a humanitarian crisis, how many media articles are written there, compared to the media articles about the launch of a new smartphone. And how often and how long the crisis, once reported on, stays in the media. And unfortunately, we see earthquake in Afghanistan during the last days. Unfortunately, it's reported once, and a day later, it's completely done. So those are the 3 factors. And we did the report in order to have a platform to provide recommendations to donor governments, UN, NGOs, journalists, and the general public to tell what can be done in order to break the neglect on the political, the financial, and the media non-attention.
Thanks, Martin. I'm now going to pass it on to Gemma. Gemma, thanks so much for joining us online here. So we know the UN has several categorizations for crises, right? Including the criteria that OCHA uses to determine which countries receive funds from the CERF, so the Central Emergency Response Fund's underfunded emergency window, right? In your experience, are these categorizations helpful, or are they doing more harm than good? And is that perhaps that straightforward? Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you so much, and wonderful to be with you, albeit virtually. And Zahra, just to say, I did hear you. We were just having issues with video, which is why you couldn't see me, but I was there. So to cut to the point, yes, as OCHA, we, amongst many other organizations, do have a categorization, and for us, it's the criteria we use to determine underfunded emergencies, which receive twice a year this injection of funding from the Central Emergency Response Fund. And unlike NRC and others, we don't take into account the external factors in terms of media or political engagement. We really look at what is the severity of the crisis and how well is it funded as compared to what has been requested. And that's the criteria that we use to determine that funding. To cut to the second part of your question, I think what we see is a practical utility of these labels in instances like the SURF underfunded window, which is to say, of all of the crises in the world, we know that some will get more attention, some will get less. And the funding doesn't necessarily go to where the needs are greatest. So we have to have a way of counterbalancing that. And that's what the SURF underfunded window really tries to do. However, I think I was on a panel recently and someone challenged me to say, but forgotten by who, forgotten how? And I think in that respect, we've got to be a lot more critical of our labels as a humanitarian community. And we have a lot of jargon, we've got a lot of categorizations, but I think we pay least attention to how people, and this goes back to what Zahra was describing, see the crisis themselves and how the narratives of power shape that crisis. So to answer in a very short way, I do think we can have some practical utility with these labels, especially to offset what I would describe as the inequity in terms of global funding for humanitarian responses. When one response gets a huge amount of attention, funding, it's at a very high percentage, and other responses get none. These labels can come into play to try and rectify that. But I also think even in doing so, we potentially perpetuate some of our own narratives as a sector, which are driven by us as a sector rather than by the people that we serve. And that's where we really have to challenge ourselves. So how do we reorientate ourselves around how people themselves are describing the crises that they're impacted by rather than how we are categorizing them? But just one last thought on that. If we don't have these categories, what happens to those crises that are neglected by who? By the Western media in particular, by traditional humanitarian donors. What happens to those crises then, and how do we rectify that inequity? And drawing on a study I saw recently, I think it was really powerful. It basically said that the narratives of people impacted by a crisis, and this should be something that we all know, but I think we need to be reminded, are more powerful than any intermediary relaying that narrative, which is to say, a person impacted by the conflict in Sudan, which today is completely off the global radar, despite the horrifying consequences, a person there telling their own story will have far more impact than me telling that story for them. So how do we start to bridge that gap between people impacted by crises and a global community who I do sincerely believe care? In most countries, the amount of charitable giving by individuals is far higher than the amount that a government gives to humanitarian assistance or a global response. So people care. So how do we create that person-to-person solidarity is, I think, one of the biggest questions for us as a sector. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gemma. I have quite a few follow-up and burning questions, but I'd like to open it up to the floor because I think these very diverse interventions get at something very, very similar, right? And I think those last words of Gemma really kind of summarize those. Are there any questions either online? Oh, hey. And I'm asked whether you could, thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Rona. I wanted to ask any of you who can take this question. When I listened to what Zahra has said, I actually realized that what is the mechanism for deciding on the names of this crisis, the labels, the tags? Can any of you or are any of you willing to share your process? And if you are, or if you're not, can you tell how somebody like Zahra can be part of that process? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Shall we take another one before we... yeah, excellent.
Hello, this is Zaynet from MSF Netherlands. Actually, my question will be for all the panelists, but it will be a follow-up to Zahra's speech about the Afghanistan situation. So when we were talking about the Afghanistan case, we talked about the problems girls and women are having in this Taliban regime. And this is the already existing problem, and also the earthquake happened, and this doubled the crisis which are already existing in the region. So my question is, how can we balance and mitigate the risks in this kind of double crisis situations for the vulnerable groups, because it doubles the vulnerabilities that are already existing in the region? And also, how can we do the fair categorization in this kind of situations? Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, would you like to start, and Gemma, perhaps? Yeah, of course.
I think you mentioned something important about the fair categorization. So that is a very important question, because we say, as a starting point, crises are neglected because of no political interest and no media interest and so on. So there is a process of deliberate neglect. But when we do this as humanitarians, we go back to one of our 4 humanitarian principles, the impartiality, and really remind ourselves that the focus is on the needs and not on any other factors like race, wealth, class, religious belief, political opinion, and so on. So I think this I just would like to highlight there. And quickly, your answer, since I have the microphone, on the names. I think our colleagues that work in the media departments, they have a good recognition that we live in a world of 10-second videos where there is a headline needs to be there, a story needs to be there in order to get the attention. So the names are playing in this tune to create an attention. And then the reports, by grouping them, is an attempt to, on the one hand, categorize, professionalize them, and provide a whole platform to look at issues, at topics, to come with recommendations, instead of jumping here and there, and each country comes with their own superlative. And also then providing a platform where the human stories are coming in again.
Thank you. Gemma, would you like to as well perhaps come in on that question of the naming?
Sure. So I think, and I can pop in the chat box as well, there's an interesting report that looks across 4 different categorizations. One is ECHO, the European Union's humanitarian wing, that has a definition that they use to determine funding. The other is the NRC report that's been discussed today. Another is CARES report, and then OCHA's underfunded emergencies. And I think that might be helpful for colleagues in the audience. It certainly was for me, because what struck me when I looked at it is we define things very differently. So what you'll see when you look down the list is that for many of the countries, they appear in 1 but not more of the reports. And there's only 1 country that appeared across 4 of the categorizations. So we do this very differently as organizations. So as OCHA, it's a combination of quantitative data. So what are the risks? What are the needs? What's the funding situation? That type of quantitative data combined with qualitative inputs from colleagues who are on the ground speaking about what they're seeing. So to go to your question, Rona, about how do people like Zahra or people who are closer to or coming from the communities impacted by crises influence these discussions and debates, I would say certainly in terms of the funding discussion, we've a long way to go, but we have made some progress, and I say this now from the OCHA standpoint, of bringing in local actors to those discussions, bringing in local actors onto humanitarian country teams, this broader conversation about whether or not we want to bring actors in or change ourselves to be closer to local actors. But just for the sake of this particular example around categorization, let me say bringing those voices into those discussions for me is absolutely critical, because we have to be in the room to have the conversation about how the crisis is categorized. And maybe just to touch quickly on the second question about a crisis within a crisis, I think the Afghanistan earthquake to me is a horrifying example of how saturated we are as a global community at this moment in time. If that earthquake, in my opinion, had have happened on any other weekend when we didn't see the outbreak of major conflict in a part of the world where we know things can escalate rapidly, we could have seen a different reaction. Why do I say that? If you're to look at the most funded humanitarian appeals right now, most of them, the top 3, are actually from crises within crises. It's the Syria earthquake. When you look at the funding for the Syria earthquake versus the Syria response, Turkey is also one of the more funded appeals. And the others are likewise appeals for what we would call, another label, sudden onset emergencies, which tend to galvanize a more immediate evocative reaction than slow onset or ongoing emergencies. But the Afghanistan earthquake proves that only happens in the West. And I want to be clear about this because people, and Zahra, I hope will speak to this, Zahra, I really want to hear from you, but people in Afghanistan clearly care about that earthquake, but it didn't make the global radar because of the competing attention for different crises. And I was in a meeting this morning on Sudan when I said the same thing, that the snowballing we have seen of crises, especially this year, but building up to this year, I think has led us to a point where even something as horrifying as that earthquake, which killed, I think, now more than 2,000 people, which took place in an environment where Zahra has described better than I ever would. There was already so much suffering and pain, doesn't even make a blip on the global radar. So it in some ways turns our assumptions on their head, because even a crisis of significant magnitude, of such sudden impact, didn't get the attention that it would usually receive. But if you had have asked me the day before that earthquake, I would have said, as a rule of thumb, crises within crises actually get more attention than the crisis themselves. Syria earthquake being the case in point. I'll stop there.
I want to talk about this question of like vulnerable population. So we were talking about this earthquake that happened in Herat. It happened on Saturday at 11:10 a.m. It was a time that most of men came out of the home to go for work or whatever they were doing, and most of the women and children were inside the home when the earthquake happened. And then after that, several aftershock that very much devastated. This had happened in a rural area of Herat province, which already didn't have a lot of clinic, didn't have a lot of hospital. And until Monday, most of those places received no help and no even an ambulance to go there. And people were digging with their hands, and even they had any shovel or something, they were trying to get their families out. So if you look at that, so women were already vulnerable to the situation, and this earthquake made it even worse. And what we are hearing right now on the ground is the Taliban also beating some of those women who lost their husband. They have no men in their lives, so they have to get out. They have to find a shelter. So if they're walking around by themselves, they risk being beaten or taken to prison by the Taliban as well. And then we have the Taliban in charge of managing this crisis. So like, they would be the worst that you can imagine. Somebody would put them at the charge of a crisis like this that happened. So we have this situation, and then we have the lack of attention right now, as Gemma and Martin described here, of like there's other crises that happen, and then like, you know, the attention right away shifted, and nobody right now talks about that. And this is happening again under the Taliban, which is like the worst to manage this. So this is one part. And then the other part that I wanted to mention and talk about is this. this fatigue about Afghanistan, that they say, oh my God, Afghanistan, I don't want to hear about this. It has been almost 2 decades that Afghanistan have been somehow in the news, and sometimes more than less. But it has been always there. So when I travel sometimes, some of my Afghan relatives say, most of the time when they ask me, where are you from? I don't say that I'm from Afghanistan, because either people feel pity or they ask somehow a question that I just, I just don't know how to answer that. This is this fatigue. And then we have a humanitarian organization inside the country who somehow feel powerless. They say, okay, so how should we deal with the Taliban? It's the Taliban. They don't change their rules. And what I am seeing right now as a journalist in the past 2 years, I feel that there's a lot happening to accommodate the Taliban. And unfortunately, some organizations like the UN, some of their agencies have, even accepted the rule to take women out of work because that's what the Taliban want them to do. And that's very unfortunate because as a woman, and most of women inside Afghanistan, their only hope is on these organizations to support them, to stand with them. And then seeing them left out is somehow, they even feel more being betrayed by the international community when they see that my not having any right doesn't change anything. There is a lot of statement of condemnation, of saying, hey, this should not be happening, but we don't see a lot of action taking place, of seeing that what's happening in Afghanistan is not only about women's rights in Afghanistan. It should be seen as a global catastrophe for women's rights, for human rights, and it should have, a global response. I was just talking to Martin about the stand that NRC had on Afghanistan, and they said if our women aid workers are not able to work on the ground, we would rather leave than stay here and be part of the Taliban's gender apartheid. I think if we had more that kind of strong action from humanitarian organization in Afghanistan saying that we will leave if you are going to do this, because the Taliban also need, even though the international community feel that they don't have any leverage on the Taliban, I feel there is a lot of leverage, because if the funding, the money goes out, they don't have a lot to stay in power. And recently we had a report looking into how the Taliban are actually stealing the humanitarian aid that goes in Afghanistan under different name, into different, sometimes pressuring the organizations themselves, sometimes distributing the aid and then going and collecting it back. Those are some of the things that is right now happening. But to just summarize it, we feel that women in particular is very much left out of this. They left to fend for themselves, and this even worse for like disabled women who doesn't have any place to go, who can't do anything, and they need the help which they cannot receive now.
Thank you. Martin, Gemma, you've both talked about the interplay as well between categorization and funding, right? And how certain categorizations trigger funding appeals and so on. Martin, I was interested from your perspective on how you find that these then impact INGO's ability to be able to respond, to continue being able to respond in certain settings.
I think it's important to recognize that humanitarian aid is at industrial scale these days and has become an industry. What I see as an advantage of the categorization and pulling a focus on it, of course, is the funding, which comes with it, but also the attraction of working there, because we also fighting for workforce. We need the best people to come and so on. And if those countries wouldn't be spotted as a challenge, as something that needs to be addressed, and that we can do something, we wouldn't be able to attract the best people in the humanitarian community to come to those places. A categorization also helps us to use our own money and focus, our own focus, to use our own funding to invest in those crises, because traditionally they are underfunded, and we couldn't afford media people, we couldn't afford advocacy people in those crises. But with the focus and the categorization, we are using our own resources to equip those countries adequately. So it helps us as well on the focus to be willing to work there.
Thank you. And the attracting workforce angle is a very interesting one. Right. Gemma, would you like to come in on that? Or
I just had one other reflection, which is a little bit of a different angle, which is that labels can also be very counterproductive, especially when we're talking about thresholds. So I think, especially in the international media, especially in a world where we now have so many crises that last so long, we've seen this obsession with whether or not crises meet a certain threshold. Is it genocide? Is it not genocide? Is it famine? Is it not famine? And I worked in the Horn of Africa during the drought these last years, and that question of is it famine was repeated for 3 years straight, when thousands of people who shouldn't have died in the Horn of Africa because of that drought. But because the label famine wasn't there, it didn't galvanize in the same way, potentially. At the same time, I think one of our biggest challenges is when we launched the underfunded emergencies window, when it was conceptualized, the idea was that it would pressure other donors to look at these crises and put more money towards them. That's the concept, right? That it will catalyze that additional funding. And I think in recent years, we've not seen that impact. And so it's now very much a case of, I do believe, important injections of funding from a central source to crises that are not receiving the funding they should. But that additional impact of the other donors in the system then really taking stock and saying, hold on a minute, how is it that we've not funded Burkina Faso this year when the needs have risen this dramatically and OCHA's just given a SURF underfunded allocation because it's so clearly neglected? Maybe we should do something more. We're not seeing that happen. So that trigger effect, for many reasons, but I think part of it comes back to the saturation piece, and part of it comes back to where the world's attention is in 2023. I don't think we see as powerfully as we should, and maybe it's something we should reflect upon, even as a humanitarian community, that having multiple different definitions means that our collective voice isn't as strong with those donors as it could be when we have different countries in every one of our reports on this issue, right? So how could we potentially make that step change? Because isn't part of what we're saying, going back to Martin's point, isn't part of what we're saying, if you're truly to be impartial, if you're truly to be needs-based, here's the black and white facts of the matter. This crisis isn't funded and it should be. And that should trigger a different discussion. But right now, I think we're just filling it internally with what we have and what we can do and not triggering that discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gemma. And yeah, the famine example is a particularly striking one. Is it a famine? Is it not a famine? We're seeing the deaths actually happening before, while the media as well is waiting for that particular categorization, for it to be taken seriously. Any questions or comments from the floor? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. This is Günther again from Munich. I think this is a dilemma that cannot really be solved, because the world is so complex that it's really difficult to grasp. And I think without categorization, we cannot function. Yeah, so to grasp a situation is already very difficult, but then to put it into a concerted action is even more difficult. And I think it's just not possible without these categorizations. So I think it is a must of human society actually to function in all areas of human life. Yeah? But of course, we need to reflect constantly on what is the story and the history and what is the local involvement in the development of such terms. And I think another problem with these categorizations is also the interface between different cultures, between perceptions, that of course would generate different labels. And I mean, we are sitting here in Berlin, it's the West, probably the majority here in the room is from this geographic region, and so we have this, we took the liberty to interpret these terms, but of course, if for some reason a different part of the world would be in global power, the terms would look different. But I think we cannot do without, otherwise we would not function, because it's too complex to actually put any kind of action into place without taking certain priorities that are based on labelings.
Please. And then, sorry, right now.
I was just tweeting my comment, but I might as well say it. So the reason I asked the question about what process goes into it is because, as Gemma said, I have noticed the disparities over the years. And I feel so pressed to bring it up because I realize, listening to all of you, that this disparity is part of why the media is also not clear. You are all speaking the same language that we have to categorize to be able to implement efficiently, attract the best talent, and understand where funding needs to go to evaluate. That's great. But you are speaking different dialects. And you need to get in the room, have the same interpreter, the humanitarian sector, and speak in one language. Why is it important? Because all your different categories, it is only the most powerful, the most media-savvy category that people like us on the ground or reporters will hear about. And what that then means is only one type of category that might not cover the multi-vulnerabilities that populations have will be publicized. So please try to think of it this way. If you're all uniform, then we as media as well will also be able to understand and be uniform. If not, we might be unintentionally helping the media to neglect the crisis because you are speaking different dialects.
Thank you so much. All right, let's take another comment and then go back to the floor.
Thank you very much, Marvin. And I hope I'm not getting the mic because I'm sitting so close to you. Thank you. It's a very interesting discussion because it's a discussion about language. And I liked very much the term that you used this morning about big English. And this is the danger of uniformity, because it goes against what you said rightly is complexity. So I think I would definitely go with you both in saying we should hate how we use that language, but we need to use it. Because categories that I have heard here, the international community, who the heck is that? Or investment, talent. These are all terms that are big English. They make very little sense. It's like agile or beyond, all those words that are big English. And I think in many ways we need to use them to be able to speak to each other. And I hope it's more of a dialect than just a different language. But I think we should also hate them because we know their limitations. So much when we talked about humanitarian is about effectiveness, and I heard the term investment. Wow, investment. How does that work with humanitarianism? That's a contradiction in terms. But yes, I totally have used it myself, but I think we should have the courage to walk that line and say uniformity, complexity, and be aware of it. I don't have a better solution.
Thank you very much. And let me reassure you, I have my lenses on so I can see further away. And I didn't see any hands up, but please correct me. All right. No, thank you so much for those comments. And before I bring it back to the panel as well. I just wanted to comment as well. I think what you were talking about with regards to dilemmas, indeed it is one, and it's a particularly good one, right? And in the humanitarian sector and in MSF, we love dilemmas and we love discussing them. But I was thinking with regards to categorizations, it is indeed whose purpose they serve, or how from the beginning of the essence of it, right? And the metrics that we use, media attention, it's of course big Western global media when you look at the metrics, right? They're the ones that are going to be the most prominent. When you look at donors, there are going to be from the global north. And so the metrics are skewed with regards to then the impact that they have on categorizations. Anyway, just a thought, but Martins, please over to you.
Just a quick comment on this. You answered it partly already. We do this for a reason, the categorization. And we talked about it today. But what we should not forget is that the other side of the medal, and this is the human stories, it is the assessment that the programs teams then do on the ground based on the needs, it's the solution that they develop and so on. And our industry, and I use the term that industry again, needs the categorization for its purpose. And then, luckily, we are still an industry where the human element is strongly there. And when then through our programs, once the money is there, that we can work with the people for the solutions that they deserve.
Thank you.
I just want to give this element also into the room. That's not only about categorization, it's there for a purpose. But there are other mechanisms and other purposes.
Zahra, do you want to... we still have some time, so no need for concluding remarks unless you want to.
Yeah, so I want to touch on the idea of like this, like attention, and also who is going to bring that attention. You touched on international media. So I have worked both in international media and also Afghan media. And as a way to change that narrative, because what we find out is that when Afghan media report that, it's not making any effect, not any attention. But if the international media report the same issue, like there's a hope that might bring any, like some kind of action or attention. So we are, our organization called Zan Times. We started this last year in August 2021, 1 year after the Taliban takeover. And this is very much our own initiatives as a group of mostly Afghan women journalists to be able to tell our own stories. And the reason we do that is for us to be able to publish our own story, write it the way we think it should be told. And then we do write in English as a way to bring attention, to inform a global audience of what is happening in Afghanistan, besides trying to write it in our own language as well. But again, we did, I think it was August 28, we published a story in partnership with The Guardian and Fuller Project. It was the result of an 8-month investigation into the rise of suicide for young women in Afghanistan. Right now, Afghanistan is one of the only countries that the number of women committing suicide is much more higher than men, which is like globally, it's more men committing suicide. So that story, if we have done it alone, it might not have bring any attention. It's not that that's the same story we would have published by our own. But once we did it with The Guardian, we noticed that there's going to be lots of discussion and lots of attention. So it's in a way that negotiation of like, we should have some sort of something, because by our own, our needs, our humanitarian situation doesn't make it into the site of attention. We should have clinging to some categories, to some, I don't know, like media or an international community, which might not be precise, but that's the term that these countries have used when they were in Afghanistan. So just going back to those categories, trying to bring attention to what's happening right now. So because we feel our own narrative doesn't make it to the mainstream media. So we have to try to find ways to tell our own story. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. Is there any last comment or question before, perhaps online, or no? Okay. From this side of the room, gentlemen? No? Okay. All right. Then, one last question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this really very, very interesting discussions. It's just a very short comment because I think not everyone in the audience would be aware of it, because we talked about words and categorization, and I think at times it does matter. And Zahra mentioned Zan times means women times. So it's the Persian word for women. So just to some categories, it is important to name them.
Thank you very much on the power of words. All right, we're going to bring it to a close slowly. Gemma, any last words, perhaps, with regards to this topic for our audience? Then over to Martins, and we'll wrap it up with Zahra.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks for having me. I think my last words would be two things, and I think it builds on what Rona implored us to do. With the sheer number of crises worldwide right now, I think all of us in the humanitarian community, another one of these terms, that these last months have been shocking, coming on top of years that have been shocking, but these last months have truly been shocking in terms of the number of back-to-back, either new crises or major escalations within existing crises. Within that environment, and facing personally what I would call a financial cliff in 2024, with major donors all indicating that their funding for humanitarian action will drop dramatically. The US, Germany, even the EU, and of course we've seen the UK drop already massively. Within that environment, I think there's two things. One is, either we can come together as a humanitarian community, or we'll get torn apart. It's the classic dynamic of either competitiveness or collaboration in the face of extreme scarcity, which is what's going to come the way of those of us who are striving to serve people who are facing, of course, the most extreme scarcity. I think these labels can have value in that environment, but we do have to interrogate them. And so what the colleague said about uniformity versus complexity, I agree with. I do think our voices have to come more strongly together about where we're seeing neglect, about where we're not seeing the resources that are needed, rather than each having our own tracks on this. Our own tracks are important, but how do we bring that together in a louder, more cohesive, more coherent voice, both to the media, as was mentioned, but also to the decision makers who fund responses? And at the same time, building on what Zahra has said today, how do we ensure that exactly those discussions and dialogues are informed by the views of the people who are impacted by the crises, and the power dynamics within the crises, but also our own power dynamic within that crisis? So yes, let's do this, and do it even in a more impactful way, but do it in a more informed way that is more respectful of people impacted by crises. I think the last thing that I would say, just reflecting on the conversation, is this is part of a much bigger, much more profound challenge that we're faced with in the period ahead, which goes back to how do we deliver people-centered responses. But if we can start with getting the resources to where they are so desperately needed, and start, I think, building on what Zahra said about partnerships, right? Leveraging the partnerships that can be created, and co-creating a voice that can be heard much more broadly across the widest possible audience. If we can do that, then we can potentially get funding to where it's needed most. But I am so scared about this year ahead. I really do fear that there are millions upon millions of people around the world who, if we don't do this well as a humanitarian community, will go without the very basics. So we have an imperative to get this right. Over from my side.
Thank you, Gemma. And I'm actually going to end this session on this very, very powerful call, because it's a call to all of us, and because I'm told to wrap up, and we can, and also because, Gemma, you're online, so people don't have the luxury to be able to chat with you during coffee time. Well, please, Martin and Zahra are still around, and please feel free to come and chat throughout coffee time. Thank you very much, dear panelists. Thank you.